again, one and all. Welcome back to the simple plot of, where I try to explain the plots of video games as simplified as I possibly can. As always, I'm your host, Cameron, and last week we talked about DELTARUNE chapters 1 and 2, so this week we are covering DELTARUNE chapters 3 and 4, and as always, there are major spoilers ahead for DELTARUNE chapters 3 and 4, especially, there's always spoilers with this kind of show, but especially DELTARUNE chapters 3 and 4, because they just came out recently. I'll go into more of that as, we get into the episode. But, without further ado, check the socials, link in the description to all the socials and whatnot. Remember that this podcast comes out every Sunday. And with that being said, let's just get on to DELTARUNE chapters 3 and 4. Now, I will do a recap of chapters 1 and 2, but before we get into that, let's get some information out of the way on chapters 3 and 4. So, DELTARUNE chapters 3 and 4 released June 5th of this year, 2025, so literally last month they released, and it's available for PC, Mac, Nintendo Switch, PlayStation 4, PlayStation 5, and Nintendo Switch 2. Now, the big thing with chapters 3 and 4 is that they advertise it a lot for the Switch 2, because it's a release date. It was a release date. What's the word I'm looking for? It was a day one release for the Switch 2. But yeah, it released on June 5th, 2025. And I will say, before we get into chapters 1 and 2, or into 3 and 4, let's do a recap of 1 and 2. So if you remember, from chapter 1, it started, it kind of established what was going on. You play as Chris, and you get partnered up with this girl named Susie. You and Susie discover this dark world. You go into the dark world, you meet a character named Rousey that tells you about this prophecy and says that basically you and Susie are amongst the three heroes, along with Rousey, that are going to, seal the fountains and all the dark fountains and bring balance to light and dark. And so, chapter 1, you go throughout this whole land, because Susie's like, I really don't want to join you guys. And then halfway through, she starts to learn how to, have compassion and kind of be more friendly to others. She's like, okay, I'll get along with Chris and Susie. Eventually, you fight the king at the castle, and you go back to the hometown, and it ends with Chris ripping out his soul in his bedroom. And then chapter 2, we continue off of that with, you going back to school, and Susie being like, oh, that was so awesome, let's go back. And you do end up eventually going back, because you go to the library, because you're supposed to meet up with Noel and Birdley. You go into the library, you find another dark fountain, so you go into that dark world, and you go throughout all of that. There's stuff with the Queen and stuff, and the Queen talks about, the roaring, which I didn't cover the roaring in the last episode, which I probably should have. To basically explain it, as simplified as I can, hey, that's the point of this podcast. The roaring is basically when too many dark fountains get opened up in the dark world, it summons these things called the Titans. And what the Titans will do, these Titans are these super powerful beings that will just plunge the world into darkness and basically wiping out any, what are called lighteners. So you have the dark world, and then you have the normal world. And the normal world, they call those people the lighteners. So what the Titans will do is just, bring darkness throughout the entire world and just bathe everything in darkness and wipe out any lighteners that get in the way. And so after you, eventually do the boss fight with the Queen, Rousey explains the thing about the roaring, and then the Queen's just like, oh shit, I don't want to do that. So she gives up and becomes your friend. And then we sealed that dark fountain, and this ends chapter 2. Now, here's the thing about chapters 3 and 4. In the last episode, I used the wiki to kind of help go through the plot or whatever. But the wiki I looked at doesn't have the summaries of chapters 3 and 4 yet. Probably fair, because, the game did just come out last month, so they probably want to wait a while to be like, hey, here's the entire story. So what I'm going to do is, probably what is more expect from this podcast. I'm going to try to awkwardly explain the plots of both 3 and 4 as best I can. So, without with ooh golly gee, let's get into chapter 3. So, as we remember from the end of chapter 2, while Susie and Toriel were asleep because Toriel invited Susie to stay at their place, while Susie and Toriel were asleep, Chris got up and created a dark fountain which shrouded his living room in like a black mist. And the last thing you saw was their TV, like the static with a ghoulish smile on it. So chapter 3 starts with you and Susie waking up on a couch in the dark world. And eventually you meet up with Rousey because Rousey is able to travel to different dark worlds. There's a theory that Rousey uses the main, like the dark fountain in Castletown to travel to all these different lands. So, this dark world, which we should remember, was created inside Chris's home. You go through a little bit and all of a sudden, like everything gets dark, you hear a weird voice, and you meet this new character who is actually my new favorite so far, called Tenna, and it's just this walking TV man, which we, made to believe that is Chris and Toriel's TV from the living room. So you meet this character named Tenna, and all he wants to do is just, put on a great show and, like, have a bunch of fans and, like, entertain people. And he keeps going on throughout the game. There's dialogue of him being like, hey, Chris, remember when this, remember this, remember this. So, obviously, he has memories of being the TV in Chris's living room and just watching his life unfold. And you find out eventually that Tenna is just jealous and he's saddened that nobody pays attention to him anymore because everybody's kind of grown away from watching TV. And all Tenna did as just a normal TV in the light world is just sit there and collect dust. So he's kind of petty, and he eventually he kind of gets maniacal about it, and he tries to get entertainment or get viewership by force, and there's a thing in the background. If you pay close attention, Tenna is somehow related to or in cohorts with Spamton, who I should say, I'll explain real quick because I didn't really do a good job of that in the last episode, so I apologize for that. Spamton is this random character you meet in chapter 2 who is just he's like a salesman, but also there's like this dark mystery behind him, and he plays a big role, especially in the Snowgrave route, because he's the one you did the Thorn Ring from. Because you did the Freeze Ring. When you do the Snowgrave route, you did the Freeze Ring that ups Noel's powers, but then you did the Thorn Ring, which really sets stuff in stone or whatever. And then at the end of the Snowgrave, you fight Spamton Neo. So, anyway, going back to chapter 3, there's definitely a connection between Spamton and Tenna. And the one thing, I will pause for a second on the plot, because the one thing I really love about chapter 3 is showing that Toby Fox, along with anybody else who is on his team, have really upped the value, upped the production quality in chapter 3. Because my God, when they introduced Tenna, it's this VHS tape with a full vocalized intro. Let's see if I can. I don't know if it's on the soundtrack, but if it is, I will play it quick. And I'm gonna try not to short out my mic when I do it because, let's see. Oh yeah. So this whole segment is actually in the soundtrack, and it's titled "And Now for Today's Sponsors," which hopefully won't get this episode copyright striked, but here it is. Nope, that's not it. No, it's feature presentation. Mr. Antenna's TV show. I will say that ending, just a it reminds me of really old Disney VHSs because it had that weird thing when it did the Walt Disney, like the old. Do you guys remember the old? Now this is dating myself a little bit. The old Walt Disney logo thing. It was just a blue string with the thing, and it had the. Actually, no. You know what that reminds me of? It reminds me of the old and now for our future presentation things before movies. You know, God, that makes me sound old. Anyway, so the main thing with chapter 3. Now, biggest thing on chapter 3 is eventually you find out that Tenna, because he keeps talking about this big grand prize for you, winning his quizzes and minigames and all that, and it's revealed that the big grand prize is in fact Toriel, because Toriel is trapped in this little like one of those little ball the eggshell ball things that you can find like you would see in pinball machines. You see little prizes in. She's in one of those. So you're just hey Tenna, what the hell? And he kind of goes he kind of goes crazy with it, and he's just you're gonna play my games, you're gonna watch me, you're gonna enjoy my time whether you like it or not. And he just kind of goes nuts until you eventually just be hey, stop it. We will promise to give you a good home if you just give us Toriel back. So eventually he agrees and promises. But before you get Toriel back, there comes an appearance from a character that's been talked about, but we haven't seen till now. The Knight. The Roaring Knight. So you have a little battle with him, and depending on what you did throughout chapter 3, there is some stuff from, if you finished the Snowgrave route in chapter 2, it has some effect. I forget what specifically, because I haven't done it yet myself, but it has some effect in chapter 3. There's some rooms you can go into, there's special stuff you can get. So, anyway, the Knight kind of comes off, prevents you from saving Toriel, and it starts a boss battle. But it's one of those boss battles that, win or lose, it still progresses. Most people are going to lose the fight because the Knight is, really powerful, and he can knock you all down, knock everybody down to negative 999. So, there is a way you can win the battle. But it's not required. So, what ends up happening is, if you win, he knocks out Susie and Rousey, and then holds the sword up to Chris, who kneels, and then something happens where part of the Knight's sword breaks off and he runs off. And you can actually collect that part to get another shadow crystal and a black shard, which Chris can use as a weapon. But I think if you lose, it just progresses anyway, because all of a sudden you find out that Undyne, who is another Undertale adjacent character, has also been sent to that world and basically fends off the Knight so that you're free to try to go to the fountain. Because your whole goal throughout this is to seal the fountain, right? And there's a thing. So I want to keep in mind too, and I think it starts in this chapter too, that Rousey is struggling with the idea of him being not real, because as much as Chris and Susie want him to be their friend in the light world too, Rousey knows that he can't survive in the light world. There's actually, I found a TikTok talking about Deltarune, and somebody in the comments put it exactly how I was thinking. So, according to Jaceford Pines, Rousey is burdened by the prophecy, Chris is burdened by the soul, Susie is burdened by doubt and guilt, Noelle is burdened by fate, and Birdley is burdened by perfection. And that pretty much sums up all of those characters. So, Rousey, his biggest thing and why he's so worrisome all the time is because he knows the prophecy. He didn't ask to know the entire prophecy, but, he does. So he knows what's going to happen, and he wants to try to prevent himself from getting too attached to Chris and Susie, because Rousey knows, what fate has decided for them, basically. So, the thing about... So, in Chapter 3, it's not very on the nose, but Rousey kind of explains that, his whole thing is, I don't know how to tell you guys that, I can't come to the light world with you. I wish I could be your friend here and there, but I just can't. And Susie's just like, whatever, like, we're gonna be friends no matter what. So, I forget how chapter 3, like, ends, but I think we did wait. So, we did a thing, I think the knight comes back out of, so chapter 3, the end of chapter 3, you see the knight kind of go into the light world, and it goes down to the shelter, which, the shelter is a place that you've been able to explore, you've been able to interact with in other chapters, but all of that happens is that you just, there's dialogue that says you hear weird noises, and it doesn't really come into play until chapter 3. So you and Susie chase the knight into this shelter, who closes the door behind him, and there's no way to get in. And you guys find that there is a code to try to get in. And that's kind of where chapter 3 ends off, which kind of goes right into chapter 4. So, the thing with chapter 4, you go into, I think you go back into the chapter 3 Dark World. I know there's a part in 4 where you and Chris and Susie wake up from, like, this dream or whatever, and you're still in Toriel's house. And Toriel tells you, like, hey, you know, we're going to go to church. Susie, do you want to come? And Susie's like, oh, yeah, sure. So you get dressed up, and then you go to church. Now, your whole thing with going to church, I mean, besides, so it's revealed. I feel like the church is kind of important because it's not like they're worshiping like a god or whatever. They're worshiping the Deltarune, like the rune itself. And ultimately, you, Chris and Susie, your goal is to try to figure out the code for the shelter so you can break into that dark world and finally face off against the knight and everything. And after the sermon, you can walk around, you can talk to different people, you can talk to Noelle too. And talking to Noelle and by extension her dad reveals that, like, hey, you know, you might have, like, she might have like a code or something at her house, so that triggers, you talking to Noelle triggers you to be like, hey, you could go to her house and she'll unlock the gate or whatever, and you could explore around Noelle's house. So do whatever exploring you can around the church, but eventually you go back out. Toriel reveals that she goes home for something or whatever, and then you're left to your own devices. So eventually you end up at Noelle's house, and Noelle, you know, you explore around Noelle's house. And your ultimate goal, like, Susie kind of distracts Noelle while you, you know, walk around trying to find answers. Eventually, you come across a room which is revealed to be Dez's room. Now, Dez is never really highlighted as much, like, is mentioned throughout chapter 1 and 2 and 3, but has never, like, concretely, like, had influence on stuff until now, because the room you eventually end up in is Dez's room, who is Noelle's older sister, who we haven't seen yet. We've heard of, but we haven't seen yet. So you find this guitar that has the code in it, and as you're reading it, you see Chris, once again, rip his soul out of his body. And what he does, so keep in mind at this point, Susie and Noelle are talking on the couch downstairs, right? They're kind of, you know, having their own little chit-chat, whereas Chris walks throughout the house into this closet full of boxes, takes his soul, throws it in a box, and then leaves. So then you take control of the soul, and you can explore around, whatever, and there's some secret things you can find. Like, if you go into one of the bathrooms, you hear a conversation Asdor is having with himself, because I guess the lore of it is that Noelle's mother, who's also the mayor of the town, hires Asdor to clean her house, because Asdor is just trying to make ends meet. Oh, so backing up a little bit, I will say there's a funny scene once you step outside the church where Asdor shows up, and Asdor's just like, oh, Toriel, what a coincidence that I would see you here. Here are some flowers. And Toriel just blows him off. And I'm like, I kind of feel bad for the guy, honestly. So, anyway, Asdor's at Noelle's house, and you hear a conversation because you're the soul, right? You're Chris's soul going through you're in a vent. Nobody can see you. Asdor doesn't see you. Asdor says something about, like, he says something to himself like, I will make this right. I'll prove to Toriel that what I did to keep everyone safe. And you're like, ooh, what does this mean? Like, what implications does this have? And it's something that's very easily missed. But, like, this big lore thing, and it's so easily missed because people could just waltz right by it. Another thing you can discover as a soul is if you can end up in a vent by the kitchen, and you see Chris in there drinking some chocolate milk, and his phone is next to him. And there's this creepy voice coming through the phone that's just like, Chris, don't let Susie get the guitar. Or something like that. Basically telling Chris, like, hey, doing needs to be done. So, you can explore more around as a soul, but eventually you want to end up in the basement, which you start to make a bunch of noise and you trip the electrical box, which will get Susie and Noelle's attention. So you try to escape, they knock something over you, like this little snowman guy. You try to escape, but it freaks them out. Like, they don't see the soul, they just see this little snowman thing moving. So, eventually, after everything, you guide the soul back to Dez's room, and without, anything else to interact with, you go back to the guitar. So, once you get close to the guitar, all of a sudden a hockey puck just snipes you out of nowhere, and Chris comes crawling like a fucking gremlin out from under the bed, and wrestles with the soul and tries to, like, throw it back into the guitar. But then Chris hears Noelle and Susie coming up to the room, so he hides in the closet. And so while they're talking, there's a little thing, you control the soul trying to go through the closet, but you have to try to do it a specific way, otherwise Chris will just snipe you back to, like, one side of the closet. So if you eventually get to the other side of this closet and you make some noise, and Susie's like, what the hell? Opens the closet and looks at Chris and is just like, Chris, stop messing around. You're trying to find some clues. But I think after that point, Susie grabs the guitar because, she just, she grabs it from you because she's like, hey, stop fooling around. I know I was just like, oh, a guitar. Susie, I kind of want to see you play it. Because let it be known that Noelle is a simp for Susie. So, Susie, they walk out. Susie has the guitar. And before Chris stuffs the soul back into his body, he gets a call on his phone. And it's the same creepy voice from the kitchen, if you discovered that. It's basically says, Susie has the guitar. I'll be right there. And then Chris proceeds to put the soul back in his body. And I think it's at this point that there's another cutscene with Noelle and Susie, and then Asdor kind of shows up. And Asdor's just like, oh, I'll just hang out here till your mom comes home. And then Noelle's like, oh, she's not going to be home for a few hours. And then Asdor's like, what are you talking about? She's right outside the door. And then the tone shifts. Like, as soon as her mom's name is Carol. As soon as Carol walks in, my God, the atmosphere gets creepy. Noelle tries to be like, oh, sorry, Mom, I just, blah, 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 and she goes straight to Susie, takes the guitar, and she says, leave my daughter alone. Never touch this guitar again. Like, she's just so cold. Sends Noelle to a room and then basically tells Susie to get out. Now, there's been talk of this festival going on because, of course, it's a RPG. What would a RPG be without a festival? And Susie and Noelle have agreed to go together. And before Susie runs out, Susie's just like, guess who's taking your daughter to the festival? And then just bolts. And then Carol looks at Asdor and is just like, if you're gonna eat, do it outside. Because at this point, he's just snacking on a snack tray. So, and keep in mind, Chris is still upstairs at this point. He hasn't left the house. So as soon as everybody seemingly leaves, you gain control of Chris again, and you go to leave the house, but you stop at the front door. All of a sudden, Carol walks up behind you, puts a hand on Chris's shoulder, and says, of course, Chris, you are welcome here anytime. And it's should be noted that when she says you is both capitalized and in red. So there's something going on with Carol too. Like she has some importance to the whole plot. But anyway, you get to basically when you get back out of Noel's house, you eventually, what you're supposed to do is go back to your house and find out that Toriel wasn't there. So then Susie's like, hey, let's go check the church or whatever, because Toriel said something about choir practice. And you find out that the church has yet another dark world. Like there was a fountain created. So in this and this is probably my favorite iteration of the dark world so far. You go throughout this church dark world, and Rousey once again joins you, but Rousey is very like standoffish and very just like, hey, let's go, let's do this, let's go. And Susie and Chris are just like, okay. Now the big emphasis on chapter 4 is of the prophecy. So I want to note that like back to chapter 1 with so Susie made a comment about like, oh, is this a prophecy? And Rousey's just like, yeah, this is the one I told you all the way, it's the same prophecy that Rousey tried to tell Chris and Susie all the way back in chapter 1. And Susie's just like, oh, cool. Would have been nice if I paid attention. So there's a big emphasis on the prophecy. And there's more displayed of the prophecy in this chapter than Rousey initially told them, because I think Rousey left out a bunch of information. And the biggest thing about chapter 4 is in fact Rousey's information and knowledge about the prophecy. And Rousey just like, hey, is trying to prevent Chris and Susie from doing certain things, because Rousey knows how the prophecy ends and doesn't want that to happen. But the biggest thing that Chris and Susie try to teach Rousey is that like, hey, no matter what the prophecy says, it's up to us, like what our fate decides, and whatever the prophecy says, like we're doing it together, But some important things about chapter 4 is that in this, one of the characters we meet in this is Dearson, who you might remember from Undertale is the turtle guy in Waterfall that sold you stuff and had knowledge of the Deltarune in Undertale. So his goal in chapter 4 is kind of, he's like one of those characters that's like all knowing and like all powerful, but like presents himself as an idiot. So he kind of helps Susie grow and like be confident in herself. And because Susie is just like full of a lot of like self-doubt. Like she doesn't think she's good enough. She doesn't think, like she's been trying to master healing magic throughout each of the chapters. And it's not until chapter 4 that she actually like it really gets it down, because the old man or Dearson kind of tricks her into, so there's it's not really a secret boss fight. It's one that you kind of have to discover to progress, because you get something that you need to progress against Jackenstein. So Dearson tricks Susie basically into trying to hit him with healing magic, because he's like, hey, I cut a little bit of my finger, why don't you try to heal me? And Susie ends up ducking and heals Jackenstein, who Jackenstein is then thankful. So Susie's just like, oh, sweet, I did it. But the biggest thing, anyway, I'm getting a little like rambly. The biggest thing about chapter 4 is like the prophecy and chasing the night, because you're trying to confront the night, because the night is the one that's causing havoc and could doom all of the light world and the dark world. So you get to a point where Rousey just breaks down and is just like, I am like I just can't handle being burdened with this prophecy, like blah blah blah. And then you and Susie are just like, hey, it's okay, we'll do this together. So eventually you meet up with the knight, and what the knight does against, much to Rousey's horror, is create another fountain, which by doing that, he summons one of the titans, as is proclaimed in the Roaring. So chapter 4, towards the end of chapter 4, you have to try to fight this titan, which kind of ends really cool, because you get to a point where like it starts healing itself, And the only way to really beat it is Dearson teams up with you, and then eventually you do this move where you and Susie go into the Titan, and using the light from Chris's soul, you basically eradicate this Titan. So that I believe that has big implications for the rest of Deltarune, like the rest of the story. Like, you've taken out a Titan, like that's gonna have big implications later. So you do that, and then you seal the Dark Fountain in the church, and eventually, so you do that, and then once you get back into like the light world, Susie is a changed person. Like, the standoffish kind of assholey monster girl that you met in chapter 1, completely different person now. Susie is just like, is hardened. She's like, well, she's confident in herself, but she's all like once you get back to church, she's like, let's just go home. Like, it's just like we didn't even see Toriel in there. We didn't even see Undyne in there. Like, let's just go home. We'll figure this out tomorrow. So you get back to your house, right? And as soon as you walk in the door, you and Susie come across the sight of Toriel and Sans dancing together, and Toriel is holding a glass of wine. And this obviously made Susie uncomfortable. You could tell it made Chris uncomfortable. Because, I mean, hey, I would be uncomfortable too if my divorced mom, who my dad has been trying to get the family back together for, however long. My divorced mom is not only not where she said she was gonna be, but she's at home dancing with this strange man, wine drunk. And like, I can tell, like, even though Chris doesn't really emote, I can tell like what his pain was, and obviously made Susie uncomfortable. So she declines Toriel's offer again for Susie to stay the night with them. So Susie leaves. Now, I will say one thing is kind of a warning for people when you got to this point, from a gameplay aspect, not a story aspect, but I will warn people, when you get to this point and Chris starts to go off to his room to go to bed, just go to his room. Don't go anywhere else. Don't go in the bathroom. Just go upstairs. Because what happened to me is that I saw Susie leave, so my thought was like, oh, I'll go back outside and see, where she went. But what happens is the game soft locks, because it thinks that Susie is still with you. So, like, you go outside and you go back in the house, Toriel and Sans are gone. So basically, you're in this weird state where, like, the game doesn't know what to do, can't progress. The only thing to do is to restart your save, like, restart chapter 4. At the end of chapter 4, you're upstairs, you're in your bed, and Chris is tossing and turning because he still hears the music from downstairs, and he hears Sans and Toriel talking. You don't see any actual dialogue, but you hear like their little like burr, 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 their little voice things, and they keep going back and forth. And eventually, you hear Susie's little voice thing, and it gets quiet. So then Chris gets up and goes to go out the window, but then it goes like a split screen thing between Chris standing in his windowsill and Susie outside his home, and then Susie. All you see Susie say is, "We won't let that happen, will we?" and looks up to the sky. So then it goes back to Chris's room. He's still standing in the window, and he gets a call, and it's that same evil voice from before, and the last thing you see in chapter 4 is that voice saying, "Chris, don't forget, you made a promise." And that's how chapter 4 ends. So I will say I really love chapter 4 because it took a much more serious tone than the first 3 chapters. Like, the first 3 chapters had obviously a lot of humor in it, and chapter 4 definitely went a lot more serious with its tone. I don't know really what else to say on chapter 4. Hopefully this helped explain a few things, and I am definitely looking forward to the rest of the chapters. By the end of the credits on chapter 4, it says that the next chapter, it might be the next chapter, and the next 2 chapters will come out next year, because it says 2026. So we will be getting at least either a new chapter or the next 2 chapters next year. So I'm definitely looking forward to that. But I think with that concludes this episode on Deltarune, and that's Deltarune so far. Like I said, I look forward to seeing what Toby Fox does in the future with it. I have no idea what game I'm going to cover next, but hopefully it's not as complicated. And you know what's funny? I say that like on my list is not Kingdom Hearts or like Five Nights at Freddy's. Oh god, I dread the day I do those episodes. But anyway, we'll see what game I cover next. I have a list. I'm compiling a list of games that I want to talk about. But with that being said, check the socials. Like I said, link in the description to all my socials. Give me suggestions. Talk to me. Tell me if I suck, what I can do better. Tell me, what good I'm doing. Just talk to me. Just interact with me. That's what social media is for. But and remember that new episodes of this podcast come out every Sunday. I've been Cameron. My throat is raw, and as always, I will see you guys in the next one.